Well, good evening, and thanks, Julie, for that talk. Thanks, Dr. Nazar. Dr. Nazar and I go back a long way. I think probably known each other for 20 years. So my job, I have two jobs tonight. One is to be the suit from Vertex, and I hope to persuade you that I'm not actually a suit. And then the second one is to tell you something about some of the stuff that we're doing. So the interesting thing about working for Vertex is that it's the first company I've worked for that has been virtually completely focused on cystic fibrosis. My history is that I'm a pediatrician from way back. At one stage I was the center director for the CF Center in St. Louis. And then I got involved with clinical trials. I followed Pulmozyme out to San Francisco. And I've wandered around the place finding the next cystic fibrosis development program, and until I got to Vertex, they weren't hugely successful, sadly. But as you work at Vertex, you find that there are a tremendous number of people who have a very close connection with cystic fibrosis. There are a lot of people who've come out of being CF docs. Many people in the company have very close connections or close relatives with cystic fibrosis. And then we have Fred Van Goor, who's our rock star, who invents all the drugs and works out in San Diego, where virtually the entire 150 people who work there are going to be walking in the great strides next Sunday week. And so everybody's very connected. And I was thinking about why that is. And I think it's because if you have anything to do with cystic fibrosis, it's almost impossible not to meet people like Julia. Sorry, I'm going to embarrass you now. But it's impressive that you're not unique. The positive attitude that CF families and patients have is something which attracts, I think, us as physicians and caregivers to be drawn to look after you, because it's hugely rewarding for everybody to have somebody who's very positive. And I'll tell you, there's a downside to it, all right? So when we do our clinical trials and we try to measure quality of life in response to all of the things, you say your quality of life is so high, even when you're sick, that it's very hard to move that up a notch. And so you've got to start putting it, at the beginning of the trials, you've got to put it down a bit so we can see a difference. All right, so what are we doing? We obviously have the Kalydeco drug, which is out there, which is for quite a small proportion of the population. And that, I would say, is the one that got there first because it's probably the easiest problem to solve. It's obviously not easy, but it's the easiest problem to solve, because in that situation, the people with the particular genes that are going to respond to the Kalydeco tend to have a lot of protein in the right place in the cell. It just doesn't work so well. And so what Kalydeco does is make that work better. Unfortunately, a large proportion of patients have this thing called the F508 deletion, which means that the protein, after it's made by the gene, has to get folded and rearranged so that it forms a nice channel. And it's that folding and processing through the machinery of the cell which doesn't work quite so well. So you have to refold it, which is obviously a lot more difficult from a pharmaceutical intervention point of view. And then even when you get it up to the top of the cell, you have to stimulate it, which is why we add the Kalydeco in as well. So at the moment, we're very close to completing the two big studies that have to be done for us to send them to the FDA, and if the studies are successful, so that we can argue with the FDA that the drugs should be approved. And the two things that we have to prove there, one is that it doesn't do lots of harm to people, so they're not unpleasant or unfortunate side effects that we weren't expecting. And the second thing is that it has to work, all right? And it has to work by improving pulmonary function, improving weight gain, improving the famous quality of life stuff, and reducing the number of exacerbations. And our expectation is that we certainly hope that it's going to do these things, but we don't think that it's going to do them quite as well as we did for Kalydeco. Because even though we have a drug which processes that protein and folds it a little better, it's still pretty inefficient. And the work that Fred Van Goor in our laboratories is doing has shown that actually we can add a second compound on there and actually improve that folding quite well, so that the research is still ongoing because we have to make that molecule into a drug. But hopefully by the end of next year, early next year, we'll have a drug that can be put into humans and be tested for its effect. So the short-term horizon is hopefully by the early second half of the year we'll tell whether these trials have been successful enough for us to move forward. And the next part of the story is the next generation of drugs, which will hopefully improve over that improvement and open us up to treating the patients who only have one copy of the F508 deletion, because we need much more potent drugs to drive that protein to the surface of the cell and open it up so that it works properly. So what I would say to you is that we're extremely hopeful. The other really good thing, which is good for the community, is the fact that we've been successful in a couple of these areas has made everybody else interested. So now there's lots of competition. There are lots of other companies also, excuse me, working on this problem. And I think it's a truism to say that, the more people that work on stuff, the more likely is that somebody's going to crack it. We obviously hope that it's going to be us that cracks it, and I think we have a pretty good chance of doing that. But there are other people working on this as well. So I think the future is really bright for CF. I can assure you that we will continue to work on this. I'm sure Laura will continue to keep up her good work, as all of you in this room do, to make people aware of what's going on in CF and to help people get through life with CF. So I'd be happy to take any questions now, and if that's not, do you want me to take questions? Yeah.
Are you working on gene therapies or also treatments treating infection, or a little bit of both?
So the question is, are we mainly working on therapies directed at the genetic defect? And the answer is yes. But also we recognize that even though, so if people, for example, the people who got Kalydeco who were already grown up, obviously have lots of stuff that's going on there, particularly Pseudomonas and things like that. So we actually have a small group that works in Iowa that is working on antibiotics specifically against Pseudomonas. And obviously, when you're a business company, you look for business deals all over the place, and we're looking out there for other things which will help other aspects of cystic fibrosis. Yes?
You made mention that the two drugs that you're for the F508, so those are only really working for people who have a pair of the genetic mutation, or just one?
Yeah. So the story is what the data told us in the early studies that we did. We tried it in people who had two copies of the gene. We also tried it in people who had one copy of the gene and basically another defect that didn't make any protein. And it turns out that because we're not super efficient at folding all this protein, we actually need a fair amount of protein to try and fold. So when you only have half as much protein, we don't actually get enough. We get a bit of a signal, but it's not really enough to make a difference clinically to patients. But hopefully the more potent molecules that come through afterwards will enable it to work in people with a single F508 gene. Okay. All right. Thank you very much indeed.